Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I was listening to an interview on Bloomberg with James Bullard. He's the St. Louis Fed President. And it was a pretty typical Federal Reserve interview, but it got really good about 4.5 minutes into it because at that point, they start talking about the loans to go into companies. And what Bullard said is that these companies are taking on debt to get through the pandemic so they can survive and thrive. And I thought to myself, no way are they taking on debt so they can thrive. They're taking on debt so they can survive. And now there might be a few of them who are thriving through this business, but a lot of companies right now are suffering and they're taking out these loans to try and keep themselves as a viable business. And then the guy asked the guy who's interviewing James Bullard had a great question. He says, it's not so much about the asset bubbles, because that's another question that they asked him about. And he says he doesn't see any asset bubbles forming right now. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, like, if everything is expanding into bubble territory all at the same time, of course you wouldn't see a bubble. And the bubble's really not in the assets, it's in the debt itself. The credit availability is bubbling up. Eventually that's going to come to an end. Anyway, we'll discuss that in another video. But he goes on to say, he goes, in the absence of creative destruction. Now you think about this, if all this debt wasn't just being poured out to all the companies in pretty much every direction with the liquidity facilities coming out of the Federal Reserve, they have 9 new lending facilities. There are 11 of them in total because some of these lending facilities are broken into parts. But they have all these lending facilities to try and inject money into every direction of the credit market to make sure that there is no denying of credit to anybody, because once you start denying credit, then you're going to have a very horrible collapse, especially in the credit market, which is going to eventually happen at some point. But right now they're doing their best to make sure that the flow of credit does not freeze up in any one particular spot. And he says, in the absence of this creative destruction, because if these credit really wasn't flowing out to these companies, right, then they wouldn't be able to be a viable company. They're going to start falling and they're going to have to sell out. And now an entrepreneur who might have a better idea on how to run those companies, or say, just invest in this company for a reconstruction into something that he sees as better, that's where the creative destruction comes in. Once you have failed at what you are doing and somebody else sees the opportunity, that's where capitalism was working its best. And now I know a lot of people are probably looking at that like, man, you're a horrible monster. You want to see these companies die and you want to see vultures come in and take it. No, that's not the way I look at things. What I look at things is that if you have overexpanded yourself on credit, if you are in a situation in which that you are not running a viable company, but somebody else out there says, yeah, well, if I pick up the company for pennies on the dollars and the little bit of money that I have that I can invest into it, I got a better idea on how to run that thing. That is true capitalism. And then when he gets in there, or she or whoever gets into that company and starts running it, now you have an opportunity for more employees and better, salaries and everything else that comes from it. But it comes from a creative destruction situation. Anyway, they ask him about that, and he says, Bullard says, yeah, I don't see that really taking place. And he goes on to talk about the credit to zombies, and that these companies were viable before the pandemic. Then, there's really no reason that they wouldn't be viable on the other side, but just a re-gearing or a changing of the way that they provide goods and services to people, because during this pandemic, all of a sudden, things are no longer the same. You got all this social distancing going on, you got shields that are being put up, you got all this kind of, scenarios that are taking place inside of these businesses that hold them back from performing at their maximum capacities. And so once you get through all this and they learn to make a viable business from the social distancing and everything else that comes from it, the limited way of being able to conduct business, and they re-gear this into a new direction, then he says that's where the expansion will really do well, and that the credit lines to these companies during this time is needed for them in order to get to that position. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, to me, I look at it, it was just like, okay, so you're going to get them a bunch of debt. You're going to have them hold off long enough that inflation can actually kick in, so it can disassemble some of that debt for them, make it smaller for them. If they have to, before they were charging $10 for a hamburger and now they're charging $25 for a hamburger, they can pay off that debt a lot easier. It makes the debt not so burdensome, and then profits can come back to the business. I'm assuming that's what they're up to. At least that's the way I kind of feel when I listen and read some of the stuff coming out of these guys. But anyway, I thought that was a great interview. Again, it starts about, what I feel is the important part really kicks in about 4.5 minutes. I mean, it's all pretty good. It's 18 minutes, so it's not too long. But when it starts about 4.5 minutes into it and then goes to about, 10 minutes or so, I think that, little 5.5 minute chunk right there is pretty decent. And anyway, You guys listen to the interview and let me know. Uneducated Economist. Talk to you later.